All right, I can see that we've already got just over 50 participants on the call. I'm sure that will continue to tick up, but we will get started now. So hello and welcome to this webinar on critical infrastructure resilience and perceptions of disaster preparedness. My name is Ed Moran. I'm Senior Campaign Manager at Lloyd's Register Foundation, who are partnering with Reuters Events to bring you today's webinar. This is one of a series of webinars we have been co-producing with Reuters to explore findings from a World Risk Poll, which is one of the Foundation's flagship research investments and the world's first global study of perceptions and experiences of risk to people's safety. Now, amongst a huge amount of other data, the poll has some very interesting things to say about the connection between the resilience of critical infrastructure and perceptions of disaster preparedness, of which we'll be hearing more very shortly. But first, just to run you over how this webinar is going to work, it's going to be up to an hour, and we're going to kick off with a 15-minute presentation on the poll findings on this subject. That'll be followed by about half an hour of panel discussion, and then 15 minutes of audience Q&A at the end. So just in terms of that question and answer session, please do go ahead and submit your questions via the Zoom via the Zoom Q&A function, not the chat box, the Zoom Q&A function, at any point during the webinar, as and when they occur to you, whether that's during the presentation or the panel discussion or throughout, and we'll pick up as many of those questions as we can in the question and answer session at the end. Please also note that this session is being recorded, and we will email you a link to the recording after the session, along with a link to the new research paper on which this webinar is based and which is being published tomorrow to mark the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. So please do feel free to share those links afterwards with any colleagues who may be interested. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to our panelists for today. So first we have Jessica Brislin Higgs, who is a senior climate advisor and chartered environmental scientist at Mott MacDonald, with advisory experience spanning a variety of geographies and technical disciplines, with a core focus on climate change risk assessment and response strategies. We also have Dr. Monica Cardarilli, who is project officer at the European Commission's Joint Research Centre. Monica provides scientific advice to European Commission services and member states to enhance resilience of EU-wide critical infrastructure to disruptive events with cross-sectoral and transboundary impacts. We also have Gerson Nethavhani, who has 15 years experience in climate change policy making, implementation, and mainstreaming in sub-regional governments. Currently, Gerson is serving as Deputy Director for Climate Change Adaptation within the Gauteng Department of Agriculture, Rural Development and Environment in South Africa. And last but not least, we have my colleague Aaron Gardner, who is a research scientist with over 15 years experience working with big data to derive insight and deliver impact across various sectors. Since joining Lloyd's Register Foundation in 2021, Aaron has led the analysis of the World Risk Poll, which, as I said, is a unique global survey on public perceptions and experiences of risk and safety. And so I would like to kick off the webinar by inviting Aaron to give us a presentation on the poll findings.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Ed. Like Ed said, I'm going to run through the findings from our upcoming report, Critical Infrastructure, Resilience and Perceptions of Disaster Preparedness. But before I get started, I'll give a very quick overview of the Lloyd's Register Foundation and the World Risk Poll. So the Lloyd's Register Foundation is an independently funded global charity with a mission of engineering a safer world. And so we work to reduce risk and enhance the safety of critical infrastructure and build resilience by funding high quality research, interventions, and through education and public outreach. One of the major projects that we run is this World Risk Poll. And like Ed said, this is the first global study assessing the perception and experience of risk, often in places where little or no official data on safety exists. And this is the second wave that we're reporting on now from 2021. It was previously performed in 2019 and is currently in the field for 2023. And then there will in turn be a 2025 edition with repeating questions. The 2021 poll had 4 areas of focus, but what's most relevant today is the questions relating to disaster resilience, critical infrastructure, and people's feelings of preparedness to deal with disaster. So to start with the very high level finding from this paper, in the poll, we asked people if they've ever lost access to one of 5 types of critical infrastructure for more than a day. So these were electricity, clean water, food, medicine or medical care, and then access to a telephone. So in the global population, 57% of people report losing access to critical infrastructure for more than a day. But if we look at people specifically who've experienced a disaster, this rises to 75%. Then if we look at the particular types of infrastructure loss, we can see some very striking results. Loss of electricity is the most common occurrence for both those who have experienced a disaster and have not experienced a disaster. 40% of people who have not experienced a disaster reporting a loss for more than a day, rising to over half of people who have experienced a disaster. Whereas loss of food was the most infrequently experienced, although still a quarter of people who have experienced a disaster, or near a quarter of people who have experienced a disaster, report losing access to food for more than a day. So this is quite interesting, and it points some areas that people maybe have more or less control over in their daily life. Electricity supplies typically supplied by national government, local government, or public-private enterprises, whereas food, whilst it may be provided, is something that people can stockpile and store, and so may be able to be more resilient in those aspects. What's very interesting is if we start and split this data at the regional level. And on this graph, we can see several effects. Firstly, that there was only, so what we have here is the people's perceptions of preparedness of local and national government. And what we can see is that there are only 4 regions where people felt that the local government was better prepared to deal with a disaster than the national government, namely Southeastern Asia, Northern America, East Asia, Northern and Western Europe. Second striking thing on the graph is that we can see that when we mean these responses, so we take the people's perceptions of local government preparedness and national government preparedness and work out the average of that, we can see that there's a huge regional variation. From Southeast Asia at the top, where 65% of people felt that both their government types were prepared to deal with a future disaster, down to Latin America and the Caribbean, where the mean was 27%. So huge regional variation. But also that there's big differences in the public perception between local and national government. From the top here at Southeast Asia, where there was actually only a 0.4% difference between people's perception of local government preparedness and national government preparedness, to the widest point here at North Africa, where there was a 17 percentage point difference in favor of national government preparedness. And if we take this as the mean across all of the regions globally, we can say that there's a 3 percentage point shift in favor of national government being more prepared than local government. So globally, people think that their national government is better prepared to deal with a future disaster than local government. Where it can get really interesting with the World Risk Poll is when we drill down further into this. So if people experience any loss of critical infrastructure, the gap between perceptions of national and local government widens from 3 percentage points to 5.4 percentage points. So if people have experienced a natural disaster in the previous 5 years and lost access to any one of these types of critical infrastructure, they are more likely to think that their national government is better prepared to deal with the disaster rather than their local government. And then we can see if we break it down by the types of infrastructure that we can see some, again, quite striking changes. Clean water and food being the ones that elect the most negative view of local government preparedness. If people lose access to these, they're much more likely to see their national government as being better prepared than their local government. Although this is true for all 5 types that we've polled for. Again, if we look at that, it's very important to note that these changes occur differently in all of the different regions globally. So this is showing the percentage point difference between local, of those in favor of national government being more prepared to deal with a disaster compared to those who are more confident in local government. We can see some of those quite striking regional differences. From Northern America, -6, where they're in favor of local government being more prepared, whereas North Africa is the other extreme, much more confident in the preparedness of their national government, 17 percentage point difference. But if we shift this by experience of a natural disaster and loss of critical infrastructure, we can see that almost all of the regions shift to the right. So we can see this in East Asia, for example, where we see where they're 4 percentage point more confident in local government previously, but now they shift being 2 percentage points more confident in national government preparedness if people have experienced a disaster and loss of critical infrastructure. There's a similar shift in Latin America, where people who experienced a disaster and lost access to a service became more confident in national government, shifting from 7 percentage points previously to 12 percentage points for those people. But there are some regions which shift in the other direction. For example, North Africa, which was previously the region which had the highest level of confidence in national government at 17 percentage points we see that this decreases to 11 percentage points. But perhaps most strikingly of all is the occurrence in Northern and Western Europe. Previously, this was a region where there was a 4 percentage point shift in favor of local government being more prepared than national government. But in those who experience a disaster and a loss of critical infrastructure in this region, it shifts significantly more towards being in favor of local government with 12 percentage points. But what we should also bear in mind is looking at these regional findings, whilst very interesting, and also mask some country level details that we wouldn't see unless we drill down to the country level. And this is one of the powerful things of the World Risk Poll. We have this data at the at the global region, at the global level, at the regional level, but we can also drill down into the country level information and also subnational level as well. If we look at East Africa, a region where countries on average felt strongly that national government was more prepared than local government to deal with a future disaster, with a regional average of 12 percentage points in favor of national government. We can see, however, that there are some very big differences in this, and also in the mean perceived government preparedness. So if I pick up two particular countries of interest here, we can see Tanzania very strongly in favor of national government. They feel that their national government is much better prepared to deal with a future disaster. And overall, they have a higher level of mean governmental preparedness with 61%. At the other end of the scale, we have Mauritius with a very slight shift in favor of local government with 1 percentage point, but also a much lower mean perceived governmental preparedness at 42%. So people in Mauritius maybe slightly favor their local government's preparedness over the national government, but overall they feel like both arms of their government aren't as well prepared. So it's important when reading the paper and looking at these stats to keep both of those aspects in mind. It's not just about the percentage point shift in either direction, it's also about the overall mean level of preparedness. And what we would suggest is that to improve things in all of these regions and countries, we need to shift both the mean perceived governmental preparedness and increase this number, but we also need to reduce the gap between local and national government in all countries and regions. So in the report, we dive into Tanzania and Mauritius in more detail. I won't go into the details here, so as not to pull away the focus from the local insight that our panelists are going to provide in the round table. But the high-level findings that we can summarize from the different experiences is that the government's having a plan to deal with future disaster is not enough. It needs to be an actionable plan. It needs to be something that can be put into action and is understood by the people on the ground. But also involving the people on the ground is important during the disaster, but this is also important to involve them before and after. So this is involved in the planning, but then also in the tail after experiencing a disaster. And this is really important in communicating disaster plans and preparedness and leveraging the expertise of local governments and also local residents is a very powerful way of building resilience, and also important to keep that engagement going before, during, and after the experience of a disaster. With that, I would like to wrap up and again just talk about the report. So it releases tomorrow, as Ed said, to tie in with the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. If you'd like to visit our website to learn more about the poll and download the report, also download and explore the full dataset, which is freely available. And also get in touch to discuss any funding opportunities, or if you would like to collaborate further with the World Risk Poll or any of the future polls, then please use the URL or scan the QR code below. And with that, I would hand back over to Ed.
Thank you very much, Aaron. That is really interesting stuff. So we are now going to go to the panel discussion section. So if I could ask our panelists today just to turn their cameras back on for that. And just to reiterate to you in the audience, if you have any kind of questions at any point, if there are any questions of clarity you have coming out of that presentation, or any questions about the interpretation as we go through this discussion, please do stick those into the Q&A function at any point, and we will get to them at the end. So just to offer a couple of initial kind of reactions from me there to those findings, Aaron, it's kind of really sort of strikes you how many people have lost access to these infrastructure services even without, a disaster kind of being involved. So really kind of showing, the level of the problem that we're dealing in some parts of the world, and kind of really fascinating how people are differently seem to be holding to account local or national government for those sort of failings, depending on where in the world they are. So we have this picture where there are exceptions, as you showed us, but on average and in most global regions, it seems that people seem to have a fairly low estimation of government disaster preparedness in around both for local and national government, but also to hold a more negative view of local government preparedness and to hold local government more accountable when critical infrastructure fails in disaster situations. So, as initial opening question to the panel, and I think I'll kind of come to Monica first on this in terms of your experience with the governments you've kind of supported in Europe. Do you think those perceptions are fair and accurate in terms of this accountability for resilience?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Well, when it comes to, let's say, disaster preparedness, it's a shared responsibility, which requires multi-sector and multi-level governance and coordination. Why? Because it relies on a series of stakeholders which are accountable for a specific scale. So what is missing is the cross-scale approach. And at each level tends to be standalone, and it's the way it's working, which is not aligned and often not actionable and well communicated. So this leads to a lack of multi-level governance, especially in terms of roles and responsibilities, not very understood across sectors, which often don't apply the principle of subsidiarity. So clearer accountability makes the implementation easier, more straightforward, and also increases public trust.
Mm-hmm. And Jessica, from your point of view, in terms of you of course have kind of supported with resilience kind of planning for sort of local city governments in numerous parts of the world. I wonder what your reaction to those findings is.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think I can start at the high level. I think the perceptions are very interesting, and perceptions are exactly that. They will be subjective based on past experiences and your context. In terms of the accuracy, from where I sit in Northern America, the opposite applies, where local government is perceived as being a little bit more prepared than national. And this is possibly down to a collection of things, but I can give a recent example where we recently had an atmospheric river event in British Columbia in 2021, which brought catastrophic flooding to major linear infrastructure, supply chains, roads, railway lines, you name it, and of course lives and livelihoods. And what stood out here, I think, is disaster preparedness, I think, can always be improved when we look back upon an event, but it was really the rebounding and the kind of recovery aspects of these critical services by local government, businesses, indigenous groups that stood out in order to fix these major and critical infrastructures and innovating along the way. In fact, our resilience and risk team were appointed quite swiftly off the back of that in the aftermath by a major business in BC who wanted to better understand from a future-looking perspective how they can stress test their supply chain. So things like their railway line, their port infrastructure. And the sort of threshold there was to look at 1 in 500 or 1 in 5,000 year events from a flood perspective. So it was a very targeted testing of infrastructure for the future because of what had happened. So that's an anecdote. And then just perhaps going back to a higher level from an operating landscape perspective in Northern America, perhaps compared to other geographies, indemnity and insurance is quite a big part of the operating landscape. And so there are perhaps inherently more safety nets from a local recovery perspective and resources.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jessica. And finally, I'd just like to come to Gerson on this one. I just kind of wanted to give you a little bit of time before putting you on the spot, Gerson, as one of the kind of representatives of a sort of regional level government here. And interesting to see that sort of Southern Africa as a region falls fairly well within the global trend in terms of this slightly higher kind of confidence from a public and national government preparedness to local government. So how do you think that reflects the reality on the ground where you're working?
Yeah, the issue of perception is very difficult to deal with because one is very difficult to change. but as the previous speaker indicated, is based on history, what has transpired in the recent past. So that will influence most people's perception. In our case, as you have said, I come from Gauteng province, a region with the biggest region in South Africa, with about 15 million people. And we have taken a particularly keen interest in one of the catchments, which is called the Kalkspruit catchment, which runs through the three biggest metropolitan municipalities in Gauteng, that is your city of Johannesburg, city of Ekurhuleni, as well as city of Tshwane. And I must say, in our region, the perception, there's a lot of reliance in national government than the provincial and local government, because the recent disasters that we have had were on a national scale. So disaster was therefore declared by national government, and the response, I must say, it was very swift. We had floods recently in the KZN KwaZulu-Natal province, Mpumalanga, as well as the Eastern Cape. So the disaster was declared by the national, and the response was very swift in terms of mopping up after the effect. And one of the reasons which contribute to the municipalities being unable to respond to disaster swiftly is that in most cases, small municipalities, they don't have adequate budgets. They do not generate enough income which enables them to respond to disaster issues. And in some cases, some of these small municipalities are under administration. Hence, the province is forced to, provincial government is forced to take over in terms of service delivery, including responding to disaster issues.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you, Gerson. And I just want to pick up something you said at the start there about how these perceptions are potentially influenced by things that have happened in the recent past. And coming back to Aaron, I know there was some analysis in the report about how potentially these perceptions may relate to recent disaster experience, but also some kind of discussion around particular examples in Eastern Africa where recent sort of disaster events may have influenced some of the perceptions that we see in the poll. Aaron,
sorry, that one
was directed to you. Yes.
Yes. So we talk in the report. We talk about the experience of Tanzania and Mauritius. So Tanzania, the floods in 2020. Overall, the people's perceptions of preparedness in Tanzania are quite high at the global level and also within the region. But they significantly favour their national government. And in part, this is because the government has a well-described and designed response plan, and it seemed to put it into action very rapidly in response to the floods. And it also interacted well with people on the ground, so it encouraged community resilience in those populations. And it has kept that ongoing after the disaster. So they've refined their disaster plan and have now thought more about incorporating things about not just dealing with disasters, but also bringing in disaster risk reduction. If we look at it the other way in Mauritius, for example, with the experience of the oil spill, again in 2020, the public perception of the government response was very different. It led to widespread protests in the capital city because people felt that the government, whilst they had a plan, it wasn't actually a plan that they could action. It was good on paper, but it wasn't able to be instituted well on the ground. And also people felt that the timeliness of the response was poor, that the government took a long time to respond and ask for assistance. And then also finally that people on the ground felt that they weren't being involved in attempts to mitigate the disaster. They wanted to help out and they often were helping out, but they felt that they were working against their government rather than with the government. And altogether, these two things, I think, build up to give those different perceptions in those countries for both the level of preparedness that they see local and national government, and why one region, why Tanzania may, for example, favour national government so much more than people do in Mauritius.
Great, thanks, Aaron. And I just wanted to bring back in Monica and Jessica on this point as well, in terms of thinking about, in your experience, what factors you think might be, be behind some of these perceptions from people about their kind of local or national government being more or less prepared when these failures in infrastructure resilience occur. Monica, do you want to come in first on that?
Yeah, thank you very much. Indeed, I mean, there is no one specific factor, but rather a combination of factors. And it really depends whether a bottom-up or top-down approach is applied across governance levels. Indeed, local level critical infrastructure resilience should be implemented through a bottom-up approach that starts from the ground, that touches upon the needs of citizens, that is in contact with them, and also with the aim of also making more informed decision making that are really effective and based on evidence. Often we see the opposite. So we see a top-down approach that does not apply, that is really not applicable or was useful for local communities, and it also affects potential planned investments, funding opportunities that don't fit for the purpose. So it's really important to keep in mind local factors and try to keep it in line as much as possible to local realities that have different cultural, social, and economic differences.
Jessica, is that something that tallies with your experience as well, or are there any other factors that you would mention?
Yeah, I think it just comes back to this thing of perception. It really is based on your local experience and how much, say, you as a community member are engaged in the resilience journey that your local or national government is on. I think that the panelists have covered it nicely.
Mm-hmm. So if we now kind of move beyond the perception a bit and look at actually when these critical infrastructure services fail, whether that's water, whether it's electricity, whether it's telecoms, in situations where that was caused by a natural hazard, perhaps it could have been prevented. Looking in the post-mortem in that kind of situation, what typically are the things that are most likely to have gone wrong to cause that access to that service to have failed? Gerson, I'm wondering if I can bring you back on that, and if there are examples from your region in South Africa that might be relevant.
Thank you for the question. In our case, the example that I gave with respect to one of the catchments that we have zoomed in terms of developing the climate resilient catchment management plan, not only critical infrastructure such as roads and telecommunications are affected, but people are losing homes because due to inadequate provision of housing, many communities find themselves staying in low-lying areas, and at the end of the day, they find themselves being very vulnerable to the effects of climate change, particularly flooding. So when we receive heavy rains in these regions, in these areas, they are mostly affected. And when the disaster is declared, it is very important that all the spheres of government come together in terms of providing alternative accommodation, and not only communities are affected, but businesses as well. But with businesses, it's a bit different because they come together with government in terms of response. A case in point, the Karlspread catchment that I mentioned, the upstream of the catchment, there is a business center where there are a lot of hotels and they are affected during flooding. So they come together with government in terms of dredging the lake that is in the vicinity, as well as improving the overall resilience of the vicinity. So businesses come into the party in terms of response, but communities are completely reliant on government response in terms of improving resilience.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, that point about reliance on government, and of course in different kind of parts of the world, the relative involvement of the private sector and the public sector in terms of infrastructure provision will kind of vary, and that may have an influence, perhaps on the factors that sort of fall down in terms of infrastructure services falling down in disaster scenarios. So I'm wondering, Jessica, if I can bring you back in again from your experience in terms of what those factors might be in sort of post-mortems on those kind of situations that you've seen.
Yeah, I think, when I look at it at the large scale, the whole world is really playing catch up. And to paint the analogy of, it's this idea that we're trying to fix an airplane in the sky. It's really hard to be proactive. So more specifically, I think what's gone wrong in the post-mortem and the forensics, I think, inherently long life legacy infrastructure just hasn't been adequately maintained or upgraded or stress tested in the face of worsening conditions. And so these hazards are happening more frequently and are continuing to break records, but the infrastructure upgrades have not kept pace. So I think the fail-safe is where we can't be fully prepared. We sometimes just have to accept that things may fail. And then it's about having really robust contingencies and recovery plans, stepping up communication to empower communities. And then, of course, we go local to national actors.
Thanks, Jess. That's a really interesting point about potentially accepting that at some level things will fail, and something I want to return to a little later on in the discussion. But first, I just wanted to pass over to Monica on any other kind of thoughts about those factors in a typical post-mortem.
Yeah, but what is, we have observed is lacking evidence-based decision-making process that often does not include, let's say, scientific, fundings, uptake of research results. So it's often a decision-making process that does not rely on, let's say, on evidence-based information, facts, and also technologies. We have a lot of new technologies. We have new tools for early warning, which can really save lives. We can really support any actions and interventions. So it's something that should be considered and must be considered when it comes to reducing impacts, when it comes to displacement of population for prevention. So a series of events that, and let's say, where we can really use existing tools, existing science to support prevention response.
I'd love to be able to pick up on that point about data a little bit more, but unfortunately we need to move on to the next section of discussion because there's quite a lot to get through here. And I wanted to kind of get onto this point about, all the different kind of actors that are involved in ensuring that critical infrastructure services are seamlessly delivered and are as resilient as they can be, with the involvement of sort of national and local government and private sector actors as well. And I wanted to come to you first, Gerson, in terms of that kind of relationship between national and sort of regional government in terms of critical infrastructure, but also in terms of disaster preparedness and response more generally. Can you give us a bit of a sort of a snapshot and an insight into how that kind of relationship works in Gauteng, in kind of South Africa, and how you kind of make sure your roles and responsibilities are complementary rather than people sort of passing the buck, avoiding responsibility? Maybe some factors get left in the cracks between the two.
Yeah. So the national government in the main will be responsible for policy making. They are the ones who developed the National Disaster Management Act in the country, and they declare a disaster if it affects more than at least more than one province. So if the disaster affects 3 provinces, it will be declared by national province. Once it is declared, then it is the responsibility of national government to provide assistance to the provinces that are affected, but the provinces themselves have to come to the party, as well as the municipalities that are affected thereof. And if a disaster happens at a provincial scale, it will have to be declared by the premier, who is the head of a particular province. Similarly, at a municipal level, it will have to be declared by a mayor, and then the municipality will have then to respond. In case the municipality cannot respond to that particular disaster, they will seek assistance to the in the provincial government as well as national government. So metropolitan municipalities in the main have the capacity, have the capability to respond to these disasters, and they respond to them by themselves. Meanwhile, local municipalities and other small municipalities, they are found wanting in most of the cases, and they therefore require assistance from national government as well as provincial government.
And just to follow up on that, Gerson, in terms of how these actors can work together more collaboratively, do you feel there's anything that sort of national government could be doing to better sort of support sort of provincial governments in those kind of scenarios?
Yes, I think there's a need, there's an urgent need to improve the capacity of municipalities to respond to disasters, among other things. There's a need to establish relevant structures, disaster management advisory forums, and just to get municipalities ready to prepare and implement their own disaster management framework as a contribution to the implementation of the National Disaster Management Act. So there's a need to capacitate all these spheres of government so that they are able to respond to disasters on their own. Obviously, the issue of disaster is we find ourselves to be mostly reacting towards to what has happened, but in an ideal situation, we would like to be ahead of this. We would like to be well prepared so that when the disaster strikes, we are able to respond by ourselves at a provincial level, at a local level.
If I can just come back to Jessica for a moment, in terms of the areas that you've worked with, sort of having an external from government kind of perspective, are there things that you've seen sort of happening in those relationships and structures, perhaps between national and local government, but also with sort of the private sector utility providers as well, that have been sort of good examples of collaborative working that have enabled, you know, being more proactive rather than sort of reactive in these scenarios, or equally, you know, things that have been sort of problematic as well that have led to sort of less than ideal outcomes?
Yeah, it's quite a lot to unpack there, but I think I can talk to the need and then what's being done and what we're seeing being done, at least at a local sort of Northern America perspective or level. In terms of the need, I think we all need to acknowledge that we're all important players in this journey. Unless things are decentralized in your neighborhood or you're off-grid, there's a lot of interconnectedness in terms of a critical infrastructure like roads, water, electricity, because it's linear, because it's networked, and so many depend on it. So at the macro level, I think we need to see more mainstreaming of education around disaster preparedness and response, more awareness and capacity building in disaster preparedness. We're in fact starting to see capacity building being written into national adaptation strategies. Here locally, we have a target of 70% of the affected workforce. So people in engineering and architecture, for example, 70% of them need to be skilled up by 2027. So that's quite promising in terms of what we're seeing. On other side, in terms of investment, I think we need to see a little bit more creative structuring of investments to de-risk certain things that are seen to be risky, like river restoration projects, to make it more appealing to the private sector. Things like upgrading and creating new national standards, because those then trickle down to the local level in terms of design codes, and improving those for future resilience is really important. Yeah, I've got a whole list of things that I could talk about, but I think finally is around sharing successes. So where new approaches have been tried and tested and they've been successfully piloted, I think we need to share these more and more and scale them up as rapidly as we can.
And talking there about kind of scaling up, that sort of leads me into, I'd like to kind of turn to Monica now, in terms of we've talked so much so far about how things operate at this level between local, regional, national governments. But of course, disasters, natural hazards, typically lots of these things do not respect national borders, and neither does much of the critical infrastructure on which we rely, particularly in Europe. So I'm interested in, you know, the next level of this, how we kind of collaborate at a supranational level to improve critical infrastructure resilience, and what role kind of institutions like the EU and like your own work can support countries in terms of improving that resilience.
Thank you very much. First of all, the key word is co-creation. Co-creation of skills, co-creation of knowledge. And so when we speak about, let's say, stakeholders and players, we speak about people in the end. So they are either, let's say, part of different entities, private, public entities, but they are in the end citizen as well. So co-creation is an important aspect that is, let's say, fostered through networking and partnership. So this creates a stronger trust environment among stakeholders that in the end facilitates response, that facilitates also communication. So, and this can be even done by, let's say, increasing and improving programs through training and exercises that can be carried out across the various sectors, across the various levels. So in this way, there is the important increasing of understanding, common understanding of interdependencies, common understandings of stakeholders' needs, common understanding of implementation of existing solutions, so, and best practices as well. So it's important that these elements are considered or being considered because they are in the end part of the same picture.
Mm-hmm. So thank you so much, Monica. I'd now just like to, I said, as we're kind of getting on in time, move on to the next section of discussion, which really is to come full circle. I mean, we've talked about these kind of collaborative relationships to improve resilience, but how do we then ensure that that improved infrastructure resilience actually translates into improved public confidence in that resilience, in that preparedness? But before we get into that, I just wanted to come back to Aaron for a moment to touch on why that perception potentially matters. Why is it not just the reality of infrastructure resilience that's important, but also public confidence in it? Is there any data, for example, in the poll that speaks to why that perception itself might be a beneficial thing for improving resilience?
Yep. So I can actually share a slide and a figure from the report as well that shows you just why it is important. So here we can see on the x-axis, this is that mean governmental preparedness figure again to deal with the future disaster. And then on the y-axis, the percentage of people who say that they individually could protect themselves or their family in the case of a disaster. And what we can see here is there's a really quite a striking positive correlation between the two. So regions with a high level of mean governmental preparedness, individuals in that region typically feel that they would be able to deal with a disaster and protect themselves or their family. That strong correlation shows why it's so important to build that confidence at the local and national government levels.
Mm-hmm. And so given that, coming back to the other panelists, or what's your take on this? How do we make sure that improved resilience translates through to improve public confidence? Gerson, can I bring you in first on that?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot that can be done. I think in our case, the example that I gave of communities staying in low-lying areas, I think when we roll out service delivery, there's a lot that we can do to prevent disasters in the future. We need to ensure that they do not occupy low-lying areas that leaves them vulnerable at the end of the day when the disaster strikes. So communities can see this thing, that if we put effort into minimizing these kind of situations, then the level of confidence obviously will go up. Similarly, there's a lot of enablers that we can put in place to improve our readiness in terms of disasters. Someone mentioned issues of information and communication, training, education, and research, particularly at a provincial and local level, as well as dedicated funding to respond to disaster issues. So if we put this in place, I firmly believe that the confidence levels will definitely rise in terms of perceptions around our response as provincial government, our response as local government.
Mm-hmm. And Monica, Jessica, did either of you have any thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, well, based on the experience, at least at EU level, there are several programs and project initiatives that trying to bridge, let's say, practitioners, citizens, operators, and public authorities. And there are different initiatives, tailored to different needs, tailored to different communities, to different gaps. And also through these programs, we can facilitate, let's say, co-creation, as I say. So in a way that we create and we boost, let's say, competitiveness, grow, we create opportunities for citizens, we create opportunities for networking. So it's let's say it's important to use initiatives that are tailor-made and also initiatives that really try to solve a problem, even a minor problem, but try to really point it out and to find, let's say, in a cooperative way, a solution, a collective solution that applies to the different stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. And Jessica, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think just trying to democratize the resilience planning and preparedness journey, involving stakeholders as much as possible in the shaping of plans, and then putting responsibility in their hands as well to let them know that there needs to be a bit of ownership from their own preparedness side of things. I think technology perhaps has an emerging role to play. It really does, but I think it's evolving quite swiftly. We're seeing things like AI and satellite technology to detect wildfires, and that's then directly fed to communities where there is a risk of wildfires breaking out. So I think having technology play a role in the communication strategy is going to be increasingly important.
Thank you, Jessica, because you just touched on one thing which you mentioned earlier, and it's the final question I want to bring us back to as a panel before we move to the audience Q&A. That's just say, is there an element of expectation management here? We can do all we can to improve the resilience of these infrastructure services, but to what degree do we have to accept that some interruptions are inevitable, and how do we need to manage the expectations of the public with that and actually ensure that communities, individuals, households know what to do in those kind of inevitable situations? How do we, what do we know about the kind of the capacity of the people in your kind of regions to cope in those supply outages, and how can we improve that capacity? Gerson, I'm wondering if I can bring you in there from the Gauteng perspective.
Yes, obviously it's very difficult to plan against disasters and suffer no loss with respect to infrastructure damage and all other things, and which is why communication is key. Awareness is key in different communities. Obviously, with the projections that we have in terms of climate change, we know which areas are likely to face disasters. We know which areas are likely to experience flooding, fires, as well as other risks. So awareness in these critical areas is very key to say we need to be resilient to the effects of climate change. These are the risks that you are facing as a region, and this is what you can do to improve resilience, your resilience to the risks that have been identified.
Great, thank you so much, Gerson. Monica or Jessica, did you want to come in on that one? Monica.
Yeah, first of all, I mean, we speak about critical infrastructure interdependencies, but in the end, also the society is a network. So as soon as we engage, let's say, citizens in terms of whole-hazard approaches, and we try to make, let's say, to achieve the ambitions of having a whole of society approach, we can as well, let's say, increase the resilience of infrastructures, because in the end, everything is connected. So we need to make sure that all emergency plans that affect infrastructures are also tailored to the population, the affected population, in a way that if the population is more resilient, also let's say the loss of service would reduce the impacts to the operator as well. So it's, let's say, a bidimensional network that, I mean, if we increase the resilience of infrastructures, it increases the resilience of population, and it applies the vice versa as well. So that's an important aspect that should be considered.
Mm-hmm. And Jessica, any final thoughts before we move to the audience Q&A?
I don't think I can add much more. I think that's been well covered. Thanks.
Okay, great. Then we'll come on some questions from the audience. So thank you everybody for putting these in. Do continue to do so if they occur to you. There's a couple here which I'd like to come to Aaron first on. So there's one which is in terms of a sort of question of clarification from Stefan Kukula. So what scale is local in the definition in this data? So, in the US, that might be talking about a state level government or a more local government. They might have more resources to draw on than many kind of national governments. Or the other local might be sort of talking about more local county level government. So what do we know about how that was defined to the participants. And after Aaron's clarified that, it might be interesting if any of the other panelists have any thoughts on how those different considerations of scale impact on resilience.
Yeah, it's actually one of the tricky bits about running a poll like this globally is to phrase the question in such a way that it be understandable to everyone globally, and that we can also very tightly define what we're talking to. So to use the example of the US, it's based on the person's inference of what local means to them. That's how it would have been phrased to them. And so they may take that to mean it's the state level government, or they may take it to mean the county level government. It is up to the personal interpretation, but the world poll is powered sufficiently to encompass all of those differences. And so hopefully we get a good mix of what it means to be local. Obviously in areas where they don't quite have so many delineations of government, it becomes a bit easier to work out what it specifically refers to.
That's great. Thank you, Aaron. I will keep moving on to the next question because we've got a lot to go and not much time. And there's one for perhaps Aaron, but perhaps others on the panel might have some insight. Firstly, from Reimar Siedler, how well do data on public perceptions map onto actual policy and implementation patterns? Many people don't know where help is coming from when it comes, nor where it should come from where it doesn't. So any thoughts on that one? But also another question in terms of cross-analysis from Chris Vivant on whether there's been any analysis of potential correlation between perceptions of corruption at local and national levels and the perception of disaster planning and disaster recovery capabilities. So who would like to take a stab at those?
So I can.
Aaron.
Right, for both of them? Yeah, so I'll take the latter question first. We haven't done that analysis, but that is actually a really interesting question. We do have information in the poll about people's perceptions of governmental corruption. I don't think it breaks down to local or national government, but it is governmental corruption. That would be a very interesting comparison, especially with the individual level resilience as well. For the first question about correlation, the other question again, sorry, very quickly. Over there, and about public perceptions mapping onto actual policy implementation patterns. This is something that we would love to explore further in the future poll. We don't have this information currently, and in the analysis we looked to see if there were global data sets that could show, whether what people thought, or basically who was providing services to people, and then where people thought those services should be provided from in the case of a disaster. And we couldn't find any global level data set. If we could roll that into future world risk poll questions, I think it would be a very powerful addition to this analysis.
And do any of the other panelists have any thoughts on this? I'm really interested, actually, particularly in this question about corruption and whether you think that's something that has a tangible impact in terms of both the reality of resilience and the perception of resilience.
Perhaps I may add something.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, what we have observed is, that perception and corruption are linked by a key factor, which is political stability. So we observe that when there is political stability, there is the tendency of having, let's say, a more solid trust and also more solid, let's say, perception that the government is doing something that is tangible, is long-lasting. So it's something that also increases the public opinion and providing, let's say, trust to government when there is the need to react or to do something. So there is a correlation, I would say, but it's something that definitely, as Aaron says, should be explored more.
Mm-hmm. And Jessica, did you want to add something on that?
Yeah, just that, corruption taints everything. So one's worldview will be completely disrupted if you're aware of corruption occurring in your government. So yeah, I think it's that trust thing, that trust is broken. And so your perception will be completely, skewed.
Mm-hmm. Just want to come to a question now from Jamil Gori, and we've talked a lot about the role of kind of national government, local and private sector as well. But Jamil's interested in what the role is of NGOs in the aftermath of disaster, and if how they go through national, local governments to be available to be part of kind of disaster preparedness and response, how that's kind of best handled. Gerson, I'd be really interested if you have insights on that from the Gauteng perspective.
Yeah, when you mention NGOs, one in particular comes to mind in South Africa. I'm sure some of you have heard about them, A Gift of the Givers. They join hands with government in terms of disaster response. The recent flood that we had in KwaZulu-Natal, Eastern Cape, as well as Gauteng, they helped a lot of communities in terms of finding alternative accommodation, in terms of food provision during floods. So this relationship between NGOs and government is key when it comes to disaster response, because government processes, they take a lot of time, particularly if a disaster is not declared, because if it's declared, then it becomes simple in terms of releasing necessary funds. But before the declaration, you an aid from the NGOs, because they are very quick in terms of response. So that those relations have been established in South Africa, and they are a key partner to government in terms of disaster response.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Gerson. I'm just going to, we're running out of time. There's a lot of great questions still to come, which unfortunately we're not going to get time to come to, but we will do our best to follow up on these after the event. I just wanted to ask one last question to the panel, which comes from Martin Cotton, who asked whether there's a danger that countries, regions, or municipalities are planning for one-off events when a changing climate is increasing the risk of us experiencing overlapping events, so multiple overlapping hazards or events in rapid succession. So the effects of one disaster are compounded by a further event while recovery is still underway. Who'd like to take a go at that?
Yeah, I can have a stab. It's such a good question. This compound event aspect is really real, and we're starting to see it enter the kind of landscape in terms of risk assessment and studies. So trying to get a little bit more of a proactive grip on it. I've seen a lot of great work being done by flood modelers, where they look at compound events of, say, sea level rise, storm surge events with inland flooding that converges upon a coastal city. So things are starting to be stress tested from that perspective, but there's so much more work to do, as well as events that are happening in sequence. So you may have wildfire events that destroy a landscape, and then you have flood, which then creates huge washouts in that same area. So there's a lot to be done there, for sure.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it on that note. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time here. Lots of good questions still in the chat. As I say, we will try and follow up on those perhaps in the post-event mail out. And I really encourage anybody who did kind of further questions, especially around the kind of poll and its findings and results, collaborating around that, or for any of the other panelists, please do feel free to get in touch, for instance, via the World Risk Poll website, which Aaron shared the link to. So that's lrfworldriskpoll.com. And as Aaron mentioned, if you go to that website, you can freely explore all of the data from the poll. It's freely available to download and reanalyze. Go on there, have a play about with it. We encourage people to do so. And the report which Aaron presented the findings from, specifically, that is going to be published tomorrow, and we will include the link to that paper with the post-event mail out along with the recording of this webinar. I should also just mention that data collection for the next edition of the poll is currently ongoing in the field as we speak. The resilience data, not just these questions, but the wider resilience data is due to be published in June next year. So do keep an eye out on the Foundation's channels for that. So it only remains for me to thank all of our panelists for their fantastic contributions, and to thank all of you for attending. I hope you found it insightful. As I say, do feel free to follow up with us if you've got any other kind of questions or discussions you'd like to have on the back of it. Thank you again, and goodbye.